Harry Truman was sitting in his private train as it entered Soviet-occupied Germany. It was July 15, 1945. He was going to Potsdam to meet Joseph Stalin for the first time. Truman had been president for only 94 days. Before that, he had been vice president for just 82 days. Franklin Roosevelt had not shared important information with him. Truman did not know about the Manhattan Project or the atomic bomb. He did not know what Roosevelt had promised Stalin at Yalta about Eastern Europe. He also did not know the details of many diplomatic agreements. Now he had to meet and negotiate with Stalin, one of the most powerful and dangerous leaders in Europe. Truman looked out the window at the destroyed German cities. Buildings were bombed. Refugees were walking along the roads. The Red Army controlled the land from Berlin to Warsaw.
By July 1945, Stalin controlled half of Europe. The Red Army was in Poland, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and Eastern Germany. Soviet soldiers were also in Austria, the Baltic states, and parts of Finland. Almost 100 million Europeans were living under Soviet military control. Stalin did not plan to leave. In every country his army occupied, he was setting up communist governments. In Poland, Stalin arrested democratic leaders who had fought against the Nazis for 6 years. He replaced them with leaders who followed Moscow's orders. In Romania and Bulgaria, communist parties took power with help from the Red Army. Elections were unfair. Opposition leaders disappeared. The message was clear. Stalin was creating a group of countries that depended completely on the Soviet Union. Truman's advisors warned him that this was only the beginning. If Stalin was not stopped in 1945, he would continue moving west. France and Italy already had strong communist parties. If Western Europe's economy failed, those parties might win elections. Stalin could then control all of Europe without starting another war.
On July 17, 1945, just before noon, Truman looked up from his desk. Stalin was standing in the doorway. Stalin was shorter than Truman expected, about 5 feet 5 inches tall. His face showed marks from smallpox when he was a child. He wore a plain military uniform without medals. Truman stood up and walked toward him. Stalin smiled and held out his hand. Truman shook it. His handshake was strong. They sat down to talk. Truman told Stalin that he was not a diplomat. He said he usually listened to both sides and then gave a clear yes or no answer. Stalin seemed to like this. Stalin said he had a list of topics to discuss. Truman told him to begin. Stalin's demands were large. He wanted Germany to pay huge reparations. He wanted Soviet control over Poland's government and borders. He also wanted other countries to accept the new communist governments in Eastern Europe. That night, Truman wrote in his diary that Stalin's demands were like dynamite. But Truman believed he also had something powerful in his hands, though he did not reveal it yet. He thought he could work with Stalin. In his diary, Truman wrote that Stalin was honest but very smart.
The first big disagreement was about German reparations. Stalin wanted to take a large amount of Germany's industrial equipment and send it to the Soviet Union. He asked for half of all German factories and machines. Entire factories would be taken apart and moved east. He wanted machines, trains, raw materials, anything valuable. His goal was to rebuild Soviet industry, which had been badly damaged during the war. The Soviet Union had lost about 27 million people, and a third of its wealth was destroyed. Truman understood why Stalin wanted this, but he also remembered history. After World War I, Germany had to pay very harsh reparations. This destroyed its economy and helped Adolf Hitler rise to power. Truman did not want to repeat that mistake. His Secretary of State, James Burns, suggested a different plan. Each country that occupied part of Germany would take reparations only from its own zone. The Soviets would take from the Eastern Zone, the Americans, British, and French would take from the Western zones. This plan would limit how much the Soviets could take. It would also divide Germany into separate economic areas. Stalin quickly rejected the idea. He wanted access to the rich industrial Ruhr Valley, which was in the Western zones.
The negotiations became slow and difficult. Almost every meeting turned into an argument about German reparations or Poland's borders. Stalin wanted large territorial changes that would change the map of Europe. Truman disagreed. Winston Churchill disagreed even more. The British Prime Minister had been resisting Stalin's expansion plans since 1941. Between meetings, Churchill spoke privately with Truman. He warned him that Stalin would never give up Eastern Europe willingly. Stalin saw Soviet control there as permanent. Churchill said that if they gave Stalin even a small concession, he would only ask for more. Churchill believed that Stalin respected strength. He said compromise would look like weakness. But Truman was in a difficult position. Japan had not surrendered yet. The United States was planning to invade Japan in November 1945. American military leaders warned that the invasion would cause very high casualties. If the Soviet Union joined the war against Japan, it could help defeat Japan faster and save many American lives.
On July 16, 1945, the first day of the conference, Truman received a secret telegram. It was from the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson. The message was short. It said the operation had taken place that morning. The results were better than expected. Truman understood the coded words. Operation meant the atomic bomb test. Results meant the power of the explosion. The test in New Mexico had been successful. The Trinity test had exploded the most powerful weapon ever created. The blast could be seen from 200 miles away. Scientists said it was equal to 20,000 tons of TNT. One single bomb had the power of a huge bombing attack. Truman realized that the situation had changed. Before this, he had been negotiating from a weak position. Stalin controlled half of Europe with the Red Army. Now Truman had something Stalin did not have, a weapon that could destroy entire cities. If the bomb worked against Japan, the United States would not need to invade the country. Many American soldiers' lives could be saved. The bomb also gave Truman power in negotiations. The United States now had a weapon stronger than anything else in the world. Stalin would have to consider this during their talks.
On July 25, the conference was paused. Winston Churchill had to return to London. British elections had taken place on July 5, but the results were delayed because votes from soldiers overseas had to be counted. On July 26, the results were announced. Churchill's Conservative Party had lost. Clement Attlee's Labour Party had won by a large margin. Churchill was no longer Prime Minister. Attlee took his place. Churchill briefly returned to Potsdam only to collect his things. Since 1941, he had been one of the big three leaders. Now he was gone. Attlee arrived to replace him. He was quieter than Churchill and had less experience dealing with Stalin. The atmosphere at the conference changed. Truman was now the most experienced Western leader at the table, even though he had been president for only 3 months. Stalin remained the only leader who had been there throughout the war. He sat calmly, showing little emotion, just as he had during earlier meetings. Stalin understood that changes in leadership could create chances for advantage. New leaders sometimes made mistakes or gave up too much to build good relationships. He planned to test Truman and see how much pressure the new American president could handle.
By late July, the conference was almost stuck. Progress was very slow. Stalin was very skilled at delaying decisions. Every proposal had to be reviewed by committees. Every choice needed more talks with Moscow. Nothing moved quickly. Truman wrote to his wife, Bess, that the conference was not moving because of Uncle Joe, his nickname for Stalin. Truman believed Stalin was delaying on purpose. Stalin knew he already controlled Eastern Europe with his army. Time was on his side. The longer the talks continued, the more permanent Soviet control would become. While diplomats were arguing, communist governments were being set up in Eastern Europe. Truman thought the delays were a strategy. The biggest problem was still reparations. In his private diary, Truman wrote that Soviet soldiers had taken many goods from Germany. He said they acted like looters, but he also knew the Soviet Union had suffered greatly during the war. The main question was how to end the deadlock and move forward.
July 24th, 1945. A main meeting of the conference had just finished. Truman walked over to Stalin, who was standing nearby. Truman casually told him that the United States had developed a new weapon with great destructive power. He also said it would be used against Japan if Japan did not surrender soon. Truman carefully watched Stalin's face, waiting for a reaction. But Stalin showed no emotion. His face did not change. He simply said he was glad to hear it and hoped the United States would use the weapon effectively against Japan. Then Stalin turned and walked away to speak with his foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov. Truman was surprised. He had expected Stalin to look shocked or at least ask questions. Other American officials were also confused. They thought the news of the atomic bomb would give Truman more power in negotiations. But Stalin seemed completely calm. He did not ask how the weapon worked or how powerful it was. Some American leaders even wondered if Stalin had fully understood the message. But in reality, Stalin understood very well.
Stalin already knew about the atomic bomb. In fact, he had known for several years. Soviet spies had secretly gathered information from the Manhattan Project. One of them was Klaus Fuchs, a scientist working at Los Alamos. He gave the Soviets detailed information about the bomb's design, how plutonium was made, and how powerful the bomb would be. Another man, David Greenglass, who worked at Los Alamos, also passed information through Julius Rosenberg. A young scientist named Theodore Hall shared reports as well. Because of this spy network, Soviet scientists had been studying American atomic research since 1942. By July 1945, Soviet leaders and nuclear scientists had enough information to start building their own atomic bomb. Stalin knew the test was coming. He even knew when it was planned. It is possible he knew the results very quickly. So when Truman casually mentioned the new weapon at Potsdam, Stalin was not surprised. He was only hearing confirmation of what he already knew. His calm reaction was intentional. He did not want Truman to know that Soviet spies had discovered America's secret. More importantly, Stalin did not want to look afraid. He refused to show weakness, even though the United States now had the atomic bomb.
After Truman mentioned the atomic bomb, Secretary of State James Burns changed his approach. He thought the bomb gave the United States more power in the talks, even if Stalin did not show it. Burns pushed harder on the issue of reparations. He told Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov that each country should take reparations only from its own zone of occupation. The Americans and British would likely give their share to rebuild areas damaged by the Nazis rather than taking everything. This was a subtle warning. If Stalin wanted more reparations from the West, he would have to compromise on other issues. Otherwise, the Soviets would only get what they could take from their eastern zone. Molotov responded by offering to reduce Soviet demands by 20% if they were allowed to take some industrial equipment from the Ruhr Valley. The Ruhr was Germany's industrial center, with most of its coal mines, steel mills, and factories. Stalin wanted this because his eastern zone was mostly farmland. Without the Western industry, Soviet reparations would be limited. Burns refused. The Ruhr would stay under Western control.
Another major issue at the conference was Poland. Stalin wanted Poland's western border to be set at the Oder and Nisa rivers. This would give Poland a large part of German territory, including East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania. About 9 million Germans lived in these areas. They would be forced to leave and move into a smaller Germany. Truman objected. He said such big border changes should not happen without a formal peace treaty. The borders should be temporary until proper negotiations were held. Stalin did not agree. Soviet and Polish forces already controlled the land, and the Germans had been expelled. The British were worried. Many of the expelled Germans would move into the British occupation zone, and Britain would have to provide food and shelter for millions of refugees. Stalin remained firm. Poland had lost land in the east to the Soviet Union, and this western territory was compensation. But the real goal was control. Stalin wanted Poland to depend completely on the Soviet Union. If Poland gained former German land, it would need Soviet military protection to defend the borders. This would tie Poland permanently to the Soviet Union.
On August 1, 1945, the Big Three reached some agreements, but no one was fully happy. For reparations, each country would take compensation only from its own zone of occupation. The Soviets could take 25% of industrial equipment from the Western zones. 10% would be free, and the other 15% would be in exchange for food and raw materials. This was less than Stalin wanted, but more than Truman wanted to give. On Poland, the conference recognized the Oder-Neisse line as Poland's western border. However, this was temporary until a formal peace treaty could be made. Stalin got the territory he wanted, while Truman got the official language that it was only temporary. Germany would be divided into 4 zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin, even though it was in the Soviet zone, would also be divided. Germany would be completely demilitarized and denazified. All Nazi Party members would be removed from government jobs. War criminals would be tried, Nazi laws would be repealed, and German society would be rebuilt on democratic principles. The Potsdam Declaration, issued on July 26, demanded Japan's unconditional surrender. If Japan refused, it would face complete destruction.
The Potsdam Conference set the stage for the next 45 years. Stalin tested Truman and saw that he would not completely give in. Truman tested Stalin and found that atomic weapons did not scare him. The bomb gave the United States military power, but it did not give much influence in negotiations. Stalin left Potsdam knowing he could strengthen Soviet control over Eastern Europe. Truman protested, but he accepted that reality. The agreements were vague, so each side could interpret them in its own way. For Truman, democratic elections in Poland meant free elections. For Stalin, it meant elections controlled by the Soviets. Germany's temporary division eventually became permanent, and the 4 occupation zones turned into 2 separate countries by 1949. The friendly cooperation of the war was gone. Suspicion replaced the wartime alliance. Truman returned to Washington believing that firmness was the only way to deal with Stalin. Any compromise would be seen as weakness. Stalin returned to Moscow believing that the Americans would oppose Soviet expansion but would not go to war to stop it. The atomic bomb was a danger, but not an immediate threat.
On August 6, 1945, just 5 days after Potsdam ended, Truman used the weapon Stalin had acted unconcerned about. The United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The city was destroyed. Between 70,000 and 80,000 people died immediately. 3 days later, on August 9, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. About 40,000 more people died. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The war was over. But a new conflict had already started. Stalin ordered Soviet scientists to speed up their atomic bomb program. He told them that the United States would not remain the only nuclear power. The Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb in August 1949. America's atomic monopoly lasted only 4 years. Truman's nuclear leverage at Potsdam was temporary. Stalin's calm and patience had been part of his strategy. The arms race had already begun, even before most Americans realized it.
Potsdam taught Truman an important lesson. Stalin could not be charmed or scared. At Yalta, Roosevelt had tried charm. At Potsdam, Truman tried intimidation with the atomic bomb. Neither worked. Stalin respected strength and took advantage of weakness, but he always acted to advance Soviet interests, no matter personal relationships or American weapons. Truman had once written in his diary that he could deal with Stalin. He was proven wrong within days. Still, Truman's refusal to give Stalin everything he wanted had important results. Dividing Germany into occupation zones stopped the Soviets from controlling the whole country. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Western Europe into a strong, democratic, and prosperous region. NATO helped stop further Soviet expansion. The Cold War was not just about ideology. It began in that conference room at Potsdam. It was the moment Truman realized that peace with Stalin was impossible, and that containing Soviet power was the only option.